Hello, YouTube. So, I was thinking, a few years back, I taught a class at a local college where I was living at the time, and it was the class was on personal financial management, and they provided the book, and the class was in the evening, and it was the typical student was older than the typical student in, say, a junior college or even a four-year institution because it was mostly working adults. But the book they provided, as I pointed out to the students, was not really, I didn't think was really ideal. And so, talking with the students, one of the students raised their hand and says, well, if you don't think this is the book we should be using, why don't you write the book you think we should be using? So I did. That's this book, Money Well Saved, 7 Steps Towards Greater Financial Peace of Mind. And one of the things I talk about in that book and is a sort of a different perspective that you can take to look at your money, and that has to do with the fact that, as I see it, there are only 3 places you can spend your money, right? And you can think of those 3 places as the past, the present, and the future, or you can just consider them today, tomorrow, or yesterday. And money you spend in the present is for things like your day-to-day expenses. And money you spend in the past is the money that you spend from your present income to pay your debts. And the difference between debt and expenses can be, I like to think of it this way. The payment on your car is a debt, but the money that you spend, day by day for gas is more like is an expense. It's ongoing and recurring. And something that's sort of interesting aspect of that perspective is that to some extent, some debt can have you can break it down to sort of an expense. And by that I mean that you take a car payment, since I mentioned cars, say your car payment is $300 a month, you can break that down to $10 a day, and that's sort of like a daily expense. That's what you're paying daily as part of your expense for transportation. And a lot of debt is like that. For example, rent. If your rent is $600 a month, then your daily expense is $20. Rent is strictly an expense. It's not a debt, but you can break that down into its daily component. But that's another aspect of how you can consider your spending. And but what I like to do, and what I did with my students back then, and with some of the people that I've coached on on personal financial management, is I like to look at their monthly income and break it down into those 3 components and figure out what percentage is going to the future in the form of savings or deferred spending. How much are they spending in the present on their expenses, and what percentage is going to debt? And then once you have those 3 numbers figured out, you then ask yourself, are these numbers good or bad? How much is too much to spend on debt? How much is not enough to allocate to your savings? And how much should you be spending in the present? Well, to some extent, that judging, that process of judging those has aspects that are objective and subjective. So you can, like that, it's if your car payment is $300, that's one thing. But if your car payment is $1,500, that's a whole nother thing. And again, it depends on what percentage. If you make $10,000 a month, maybe $1,500 in car payment is okay. But if you make $4,000 a month, then $1,500, is that good or bad? Well, again, it's subjective, but again, just a perspective, just something to consider, and an interesting way to look at where your money is going, and it may sort of show. It's an easy way to look at it and say, you know what, I think I need to move some of my income out of that debt category so that I can increase the amount I'm saving. But until you do that exercise and really have it documented so you can look at that number, look at those numbers, you really can't consciously make a decision to increase one or decrease another. So let me see. So just a thought, and again, it's sort of based on the idea that how much is enough, how much is too much. Sort of maybe this is the Goldilocks perspective on money. Enough, not enough, or too much. And so it's totally up to you, but and sometimes you hear talk about there's such a thing as good debt and bad debt, and actually I agree with that. Certainly, the mortgage on a home has a good aspect of it, but there's also one negative aspect of all debt, and that is that it limits, to a real extent, the amount of your income that you can allocate to the present and the future. So it not only acts to reduce the amount you have available for savings, it also reduces the amount you have to pay your costs of living, and can actually depress your lifestyle. If all the money's going to pay the bills you incurred in the past, it does have that negative aspect of tamping down those other categories. And debt that I consider really bad is the debt you tend to see on credit cards, because credit cards are a common way in which that enable people to spend more than they earn. And some examples of that really bad consumption debt is like when you put a restaurant bill on a credit card and you end up paying for it over the next 12 months or whatever, or clothing. Every piece of clothing you buy basically loses all of its value, as soon as it's considered used. So when you're considering those three categories, you might further dig a little deeper on the debt side, on the money you're spending in the past, and say, which part of this debt maybe has some positive aspects about it, and what part of that spending has no positive aspects. And generally, it will be that money you spent on a credit card, or you put on a credit card, and you end up paying off over time. But just a thought, and if you have any of your own thoughts on the subject, I'd ask that you leave a comment below so we can maybe start a discussion on this. So thank you for your time.